So last week was a really busy week, and so what we're going to do is actually try to fit two stories into the presentation today. One of these stories is going to focus on the German Constitutional Court decision that was rendered on the 5th of May. That Constitutional Court decision focused on the Public Sector Purchase Program, which is the European System of Central Banks program to purchase public sector securities, so government debt instruments, as part of its larger asset purchase program. So it's trying to stimulate the economy by buying these securities. And the German Constitutional Court rendered a decision on the 5th of May that said that this program may not be within the powers of the ECB. It may be an illegal program. This clearly has implications for the European Central Bank. Since the European Court of Justice had already ruled in 2018 that it was a legal program, this represents a fight between the German Constitutional Court and the European Court of Justice as well. So we'll have to look at those implications. But the real focus, I would argue, is on Germany and not on Europe, because this is really a communication from the German Constitutional Court to the federal government of Germany. So we'll have to look at how that particular confrontation plays out. The second story that we're going to look at is something that happened on the 8th of May, and that's a decision by the Eurogroup to structure the assistance that it's going to make available through the European Stability Mechanism. Now, this is something that the Eurogroup decided on the basis of guidance from the European Stability Mechanism and the European Commission, so we'll talk about that. It clearly has implications for how the European Stability Mechanism works, so we'll have to bring that in as well. But again, the focus is really going to be on Italy and not on Europe. This has become a domestic story in Italian politics, and we'll have to explain why that's been the case. And then we'll try to draw conclusions from these two very different accounts. Well, let's start with the German Constitutional Court. The European Court of Justice, so the German Constitutional Court argued, acted outside of its own mandate when it delivered a ruling in December of 2018, arguing that the European Central Bank was working within its own mandate in providing this public sector purchase program. The European Court of Justice, so the German Constitutional Court argued, acted outside its mandate because it provided a ruling that was internally inconsistent. Inconsistent with previous case law, inconsistent in its own reading. The term that is provided in the English language version of the judgment is that the ECJ's ruling was incomprehensible, and yet the implication is that whatever the ECJ did, it wasn't rule on the law, it was something else, and that something else is outside of the ECJ's mandate. Which has important implications. I've used the German acronym for the German Constitutional Court, which is Bundesverfassungsgericht, so that's BVerfG. And what the Bundesverfassungsgericht with the German Constitutional Court argued is that it cannot apply an incomprehensible ruling from the European Court of Justice. And so it's going to have to rule on the proportionality of ECB policy itself. Proportionality, or so the German court argued, is that the monetary policy objectives of these instruments have to be weighed against the economic or fiscal policy consequences of using these instruments. And the German court listed a whole bunch of consequences that having the ECB buy large amounts of sovereign debt would have for savers, for market functions, for the way fiscal policy is conducted. And the German court is not saying it's in a position to assess the proportionality, whether the policy makes sense given the cost that it entails. But critically, the European Central Bank has not been assessing this proportionality. The German court argues quite explicitly that there's no evidence that the ECB ever thought about proportionality when it made its policy. Now, that argument is a little bit hard to understand. There's lots of evidence that the ECB considers the economic and fiscal implications of its actions. Indeed, it would be odd if the ECB did not do that. Nevertheless, what the German court wants is a very structured form of reasoning, and the ECB has 3 months to show this very structured form of reasoning, and the only way, according to the German court, that the ECB can show this is providing a new decision in favor of the public sector purchase program that explicitly maintains that the program is proportional in terms of monetary policy objectives offset by economic and fiscal policy implications. So in effect, what the German court is asking to do, the ECB to do, is to change the way it makes decisions so that they can be assessed more readily by the German Constitutional Court, which has asserted the responsibility for making that assessment. Actually, that's not quite right. The German Constitutional Court doesn't want to make that assessment. The German Constitutional Court wants the German government to make that assessment, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Nevertheless, the ECB has 3 months to comply, which brings us all the way to the beginning of August. If it fails to provide a new decision within those 3 months, where the proportionality is an explicit factor in the decision-making process, then the Bundesbank, which is the German central bank, must withdraw from the public sector purchase program, and indeed it must work out a schedule with the other central banks of Europe for offloading all of those public sector assets that the Bundesbank has accumulated to date, right? So it's going to have to sell a bunch of sovereign debt back into the market if the ECB doesn't comply with this requirement put upon it by the German Constitutional Court. Okay, now this sounds like the ball is in the ECB's court, but unfortunately, the ECB cannot really respond to this request. It can't really respond for two different reasons. One is that in Article 130 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union forbids the ECB from responding to this kind of request, right? Because what that article says is neither the European Central Bank nor a national central bank nor any member of their decision-making bodies shall seek or take instructions from union institutions, bodies, offices, or agencies from any government of a member state or from any other body. And that means that the German Constitutional Court can provide this instruction to the ECB, but the ECB cannot take this instruction. Actually, it's an open question about whether the German Constitutional Court can provide this kind of instruction. If you look at the sentence that I did not highlight, the sentence that follows, you'll see that all these other organizations are supposed not to seek to influence the members of the decision-making bodies of the European Central Bank in the performance of their task. And so in that sense, the German Constitutional Court may actually have exceeded its authority under Article 130, and that could be a reason for the European Commission to lodge a complaint. As a matter of fact, one of the German Green members of European Parliament has written a letter to the German president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, asking her to look at this, and she has replied that she is going to look at this, right? But as for the ECB, which is the point I'm trying to make here, the ECB can't really do anything. So what the ECB did, and that's the smaller quote that you see at the bottom, is point out first that it took note of the fact that the German Constitutional Court has ruled on the public sector purchase program, but it also noted that the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Court of Justice, has ruled already that the ECB is acting within its price stability mandate. So the ECB can't really respond. It's got the ECJ behind it, and it can't receive instructions from the German court. The European Court of Justice cannot yield here either. And in fact, the European Court of Justice has made this clear in an unusual statement published on the 8th of May, where it says, look, we never comment on a judgment of a national court, but we have to assert here specifically that the Court of Justice alone, which was created for this purpose by the member states, has jurisdiction to rule that an act of an EU institution is contrary to EU law, right? So in fact, only the Court of Justice of the European Union is allowed to rule on these things. It can't allow the German Constitutional Court to make those rulings on its behalf, no matter what reasoning the German Constitutional Court might bring to bear in the specific case. And then it says this sort of line at the bottom: the institution will refrain from communicating further on this matter. It cannot have its authority questioned, because if it's questioned by the German courts, then it'd be questioned by the Polish courts and just about any other courts for that matter. There's a great Twitter thread by my colleague Alessandro Merli that basically lists all the fictitious constitutional court challenges that could flow from this, and then developed a lot of hilarity among people who follow monetary policy. But I'm sure for European jurists, it's rather less funny and more alarming that the whole rule of law notion could come apart in this way. So who's going to have to respond? Well, the German federal government is the one that needs to respond. Why? First, because the German federal government, at least according to the German Constitutional Court, has already violated the rights of the complainants in the case that was being decided by failing to take suitable steps challenging that the ECB neither assessed nor substantiated that the measures provided for in the decisions that frame the public sector purchase program satisfy the principle of proportionality. In other words, the federal government and the German Bundestag are violating constitutional rights of the German citizens by failing to secure correct decision making at the ECB level. Now, this is a really powerful challenge for the German Constitutional Court to make. I don't know enough about the way the law works to be able to assess the extent to which those complainants could bring suit for damages with the German government or the German Bundestag. But it's not comforting for these other quote-unquote constitutional organs to be found violating the German Constitution. And indeed, the only way for them to respond, at least according to the German Constitutional Court, is to enforce this requirement on the ECB, right? So that's why the German Constitutional Court says that the federal government and the Bundestag are required to take steps seeking to ensure that the ECB conducts a proportionality assessment in relation to the public sector purchase program, and they must clearly communicate their legal view to the ECB to take other steps to ensure that conformity with the treaties is restored. So it's up to the government and the Bundestag to get the ECB to change its decision-making policies. Now, this is actually a rather alarming struggle, because the German government is the last entity that would want to violate the political independence of the ECB. And yet the rumors are, and these are unsubstantiated rumors that were published in Der Spiegel, the rumors are that Olaf Scholz, the German finance minister, is already preparing to begin assessing the proportionality of the pandemic emergency purchase program, for example. And so there are many ways in which the German federal government could begin to interfere with the way policy is being made in the governing council of the ECB, or at least try to do so. And if that were to happen, that would be a big change in Germany's position vis-a-vis the rest of Europe. Now, we're not likely to see that, I don't think. But I'm not quite sure how the German government gets itself out of the box, right? Because it can't be caught violating the rights of its citizens, particularly fundamental constitutional rights. It can't ignore its own constitutional court, and it can't really change the rules at the European level either. So something's got to give, and I'm curious, and I think we all should be curious to see how the German government resolves this particular problem, particularly given the potential that this has to generate lots of noise within the Bundestag as well. Well, the market reaction to this was not at all comforting. If you look to the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that big jump in the spreads between Italian and German bonds at 10 years to well over 250 basis points. That was when the ruling was announced, and people began to worry. And it's interesting that market reaction lasted for the next couple of days, but then on Friday, somehow the markets calmed down again, right? So there was a strong reaction, but it's not a permanent reaction, and that's why we have to have another story, right? And that story is the story about the Eurogroup. Now, what the Eurogroup was supposed to be deciding on, was the charge that was given to it by the 23rd of April European Council, where they said, we need some plan to figure out how the European Stability Mechanism can be brought into play. And the plan was to create a new pandemic emergency financing facility that the ESM would provide of 2% of GDP worth of funds for any country that asks for it. And the only requirement would be that those funds be used to support direct and indirect healthcare costs, right, associated with the pandemic. Now, we've talked about this in the past. It seems like a lot of the concerns that I've raised before have all sort of been swept under the rug. These countries are all going to get a maximum amount of money, and they're all eligible. I mean, as a matter of fact, the European Stability Mechanism announced on the 6th of May that all countries are eligible in the euro area are eligible for support. That means they have sustainable debts. They're not running excessive deficits, and they're not losing access to the markets, right? I mean, this is the debt sustainability side of this analysis is actually really interesting, particularly in the Italian case, because there are a lot of people in the private sector who are saying, look, this Italian sovereign debt is unsustainable over the long term. And the European Stability Mechanism says, well, if we're looking at a 10-year time horizon, there's no reason to doubt the sustainability of Italian public debt. So that's good news. That recommendation from the European Stability Mechanism fed into a recommendation from the European Commission on the 7th of May, where the European Commission argued that any support from the ESM should come with only very light supervision. Most of the supervision would be ex ante. In other words, this debt sustainability analysis is the only debt sustainability analysis that will need to be done. And indeed, the only form of supervision should come on the expenditure side. So there's not going to be any macroeconomic adjustment program, no interference with domestic policy. Instead, all they're going to have and all they're going to care about is whether the money is spent on direct or indirect healthcare costs. And once that's demonstrated, then they get the money. Now, this is a very generous recommendation. Even more surprising, the Eurogroup agreed to accept this recommendation, both from the European Stability Mechanism that all countries are eligible, and from the European Commission that it should have very light supervision. And the Eurogroup accepted recommendations on the term sheet that put the cost really low. There's a markup over the borrowing cost of the European Stability Mechanism that'll be about 10 basis points. There's a startup fee of about 25 basis points. And then there's an annual maintenance fee of about 5 basis points. But what we're talking about, in essence, right, is a very, very low cost of debt. And the maturity is long. It's about a 10-year maturity on average. And the facility is available until 2022, right? So from the 1st of June 2020 all the way into 2022, you can tap into this money, get the money, you get these long-term lending agreements or borrowing agreements, and the cost is really low. So this is about the best term sheet we could possibly have imagined for this ESM support facility. The news is really good, and that's why you saw the spreads go down on Friday. Nevertheless, good is not awesome, I guess, and the Italian Parliament may not go for it. So we need to pay a little bit of attention to what's going on. Part of the reason that the Italian Parliament may not go for it is because of the electoral sensitivities. That's the electoral data that I've put on the left-hand side of your screen. But the most important reason has to do with the parliamentary arithmetic that I put on the right-hand side of your screen. You see, the fact of the matter is the brothers of Italy, the Lega and the Five-Star Movement, don't really like the ESM. And if you add those guys up together in the Senate, there's no way to find a majority that would support accessing the ESM. Since there has to be a parliamentary vote, somehow Giuseppe Conte needs to get those 96 members of the Five-Star Movement to vote in favor of accessing funding from the European Stability Mechanism. He's got a strategy for how he's going to do that. That's what I've been reading about in the papers today. I'm dubious as to how easily that strategy will be implemented. Having said that, there's a real parliamentary fight that's going to have to take place as Conte structures this to overcome the five-star movement's very deep-seated hatred for the European Stability Mechanism and very deep-seated suspicion that any access to ESM financing is just a one-way ticket to loss of sovereignty, right? Something that the Fratelli d'Italia and the Lega also believe. So in that sense, it's a really good deal, but the Italian parliament may not go for it. Okay, so what do we draw from this? Well, first, we've got to keep an eye on the institutional response for the German Constitutional Court ruling. I know I mentioned already that Ursula von der Leyen is thinking about infringement proceedings against Germany. I don't really see that going anywhere, but that's one possibility. As I mentioned, I don't see what the ECB can do. I'm not quite sure what the Court of Justice of the European Union could do either. So I would urge you to pay more attention to what the German government does and to get a really clear sense of how the German government is positioning itself, both vis-a-vis its European obligations and vis-a-vis the Constitutional Court in Germany, because something somewhere has to give. Now, while you're looking at that, be sure to keep track of the Italian political debate at the same time. I believe that Conte is maneuvering for some way to get an ESM program through the Italian parliament. I'm just still unclear how he's going to succeed in doing that. So keeping an eye on the debate is going to give us some early indications as to whether that's even at all possible. I guess what we're learning from this is that the domestic politics is central to this crisis, at least in political terms, even more important than politics at the European level. So as much as we might talk about solidarity from one country to another or north to south or whatever, blah, 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 the reality is that's not the main story. The main story is what's going on inside these countries. And I would suggest, and it's something that I think we should check in again about later on, that domestic policy is going to get, or politics is going to get much more challenging, much more tense as this coronavirus crisis drags on, and as the economic consequences, which we now see are going to be really, really damaging, begin to be felt in a widespread way as more and more firms go bankrupt, as more and more people lose their jobs, and as summer turns into autumn and we face the prospect of another lockdown. I think there are lots of things that we'll need to pay attention to in the domestic political arena that will be determinant in many respects as to how European governments respond both to their European obligations and to their commitments to one another. Anyway, thanks for taking the time. It was good speaking with you, and I'll see you again soon.